Imagine surviving the worst maritime disaster in history. Now imagine getting back on a ship and doing it all over again. And then again, 3 disasters, 3 sinkings. 3 times she should have died. But Violet Jessop walked away from all of them. People called her cursed. Sailors refused to sail with her. They said ships sank whenever she stepped aboard. But Violet kept sailing, she kept working, she kept surviving. And decades after the Titanic went down, her phone rang. A woman's voice asked, "Are you the Violet who saved a baby on the Titanic?" When Violet said yes, the woman replied, "I was that baby." Then she hung up and was never heard from again. This is the story of Miss Unsinkable, the woman who cheated death 3 times and lived with mysteries that would haunt her for 60 years. Violet Constance Jessop was born in 1887 in Argentina to Irish immigrant parents. Her early life was marked by struggle and illness. She contracted tuberculosis as a child and wasn't expected to survive. But survive she did, defying doctors' predictions. It was the first of many times Violet would prove impossible to kill. By her early 20s, Violet needed to support her family after her father's death. She was beautiful, hardworking, and Catholic, with a strong sense of duty. She chose a career that would take her across the oceans. She became a stewardess on passenger ships. It was 1908, and the golden age of ocean liners was just beginning. Violet joined the White Star Line, working aboard their magnificent ships, serving wealthy passengers in first class. She was good at her job, professional and kind. She had no idea that her career choice would put her at the center of maritime history's darkest chapters. Her first brush with disaster came in 1911, aboard the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship and the largest vessel afloat at the time. On September 20th, the Olympic collided with the British warship HMS Hawke near the Isle of Wight. The impact was severe, tearing a massive hole in the Olympic's hull. The ship didn't sink, but it came terrifyingly close. Passengers panicked as water flooded compartments and the massive vessel listed dangerously. Violet helped with the evacuation, keeping her composure while others fell apart. The Olympic limped back to port for repairs. It was Violet's first taste of maritime disaster. Most people would have quit. Most people would have found work on dry land after such a traumatic experience. But Violet needed the job. The pay was good, and her family depended on her income. So when the White Star Line offered her a position on their newest ship, the grandest, most luxurious liner ever built, she accepted. The ship was called the Titanic, April 10, 1912. Violet Jessop boarded the RMS Titanic at Southampton as a first-class stewardess. She was 24 years old. The ship was magnificent beyond description, and Violet was assigned to attend to the wealthiest passengers in the world. For 4 days, she performed her duties perfectly, serving meals, making beds, ensuring the comfort of millionaires and aristocrats. The ship was called Unsinkable. Everyone believed it. After the Olympic incident, Violet probably felt relieved to be on such a safe, modern vessel. Then came the night of April 14th. Violet was probably preparing for bed when the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. She felt the impact, heard the grinding sound of ice against steel. Having survived the Olympic collision, she understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. As crew members began waking passengers and ordering them to the boat deck, Violet helped women and children into their life jackets. She stayed calm, professional, doing her job even as the ship began its deadly tilt. On the boat deck, chaos reigned. Lifeboats were being loaded and lowered. Officers were shouting orders. Passengers were crying and praying. As Violet waited near the boats, helping terrified women climb in, one of the officers suddenly thrust a bundle into her arms. It was a baby, wrapped in blankets. "Take care of this child," he ordered, and before Violet could respond, she was being helped into Lifeboat 16. Violet sat in that lifeboat, holding a stranger's baby, watching the Titanic die. She held that infant through the entire nightmare, through the screaming of 1,500 people drowning in the freezing Atlantic, through the terrible silence that followed, through the long hours of cold darkness before the rescue ship Carpathia arrived at dawn. The baby never cried. Violet kept it warm, kept it safe, even as she watched the greatest ship in the world slip beneath the surface. When the Carpathia picked up the survivors and brought them to New York, something strange happened. A woman appeared and snatched the baby from Violet's arms without a word of thanks, without even identifying herself, just grabbed the child and disappeared into the crowd. Violet never learned who the woman was or whose baby she'd been holding. The child wasn't listed on any official survivor records. It was as if the baby had never existed. Most people who survived the Titanic never set foot on a ship again. The trauma was too great, the memories too horrific. But Violet Jessop, after surviving her second maritime disaster, did something extraordinary. She went back to work on ocean liners. She needed the money, she needed the job, and perhaps on some level she refused to let fear control her life. During World War, Violet served as a nurse on hospital ships, transporting wounded soldiers across dangerous waters filled with German U-boats and mines. In 1916, she was assigned to the HMS Britannic, the third and final sister ship of the Olympic and Titanic. The Britannic had been converted into a hospital ship, painted white with large red crosses to identify it as a non-combatant vessel under the Geneva Convention. On the morning of November 21, 1916, the Britannic was sailing through the Aegean Sea near the Greek island of Key. Violet was likely in the middle of her nursing duties when the massive explosion rocked the ship. The Britannic had struck a mine, and unlike the Titanic, which took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, the Britannic went down in less than an hour. Violet found herself in a third disaster. She rushed to help with the evacuation, but this time the sinking was chaotic and rushed. Lifeboats were being launched while the ship was still moving forward, and the massive propellers were still turning. As Violet prepared to abandon ship, she faced a horrifying choice: to stay on the sinking vessel or jump into water where the ship's propellers were churning. She jumped. Violet plunged into the Aegean Sea and immediately felt herself being pulled toward the ship's massive propellers. She was sucked underwater, and something, most likely a propeller blade, struck her head with tremendous force. She nearly drowned, nearly had her skull crushed, nearly died in the worst way imaginable. But somehow she surfaced. Somehow she swam clear of the propellers. Somehow, despite a fractured skull and severe injuries, she survived to be pulled into a lifeboat. 3 disasters. 3 ships, 3 times she should have died, and 3 times impossibly Violet Jessop lived. After the Britannic sinking, people started talking. Sailors are superstitious, and Violet had now survived 3 major maritime disasters. Some called her blessed, protected by God. Others called her cursed, a jinx who brought doom to any ship she sailed on. Some sailors refused to cruise ships if they heard Violet Jessop was aboard. She was Miss Unsinkable, and depending on who you asked, that was either a miracle or a curse. But what did Violet herself think? She was a devout Catholic, deeply religious, and she believed that God had a purpose for her survival. She must have asked herself why. Why had she lived when 1,500 died on the Titanic? Why had she survived 3 disasters when so many others perished? She had no answers, only faith that there was a reason. Violet continued working on ships for years after the Britannic. Think about that, 3 disasters, and she kept going back. That's not denial, that's either extraordinary courage or a woman who simply refused to be defeated by fear. She sailed through the 1920s and 1930s, eventually retiring from sea life and settling down in England. She never married, though she had relationships. She wrote her memoirs sharing her extraordinary experiences with the world. But the mysteries haunted her, especially the baby. For decades, Violet wondered about that child she'd held in the lifeboat. Who was it? Whose baby had she saved? Why had the mother never thanked her or even identified herself? It remained an unanswered question, a strange detail in the chaos of that terrible night. Then, sometime in the 1960s, accounts vary on the exact year, Violet's phone rang. She answered, and a woman's voice asked, "Are you the Violet who saved a baby on the Titanic?" Violet, now in her 70s, replied yes. The woman said, "I was that baby." And then she hung up. Violet tried to call back, tried to trace the call, tried to find out who the woman was. But there was no way to track her down. No name, no number, no information. Just those few words and then silence. Was it really the baby now grown? Or was it a hoax, someone who'd read Violet's story and decided to play a cruel trick? We'll never know. Violet never heard from the woman again. Violet Jessop died in 1971 at the age of 83. She'd lived a long life, far longer than those 1,500 souls who went down with the Titanic. She was buried with rosary beads she'd carried since that night in 1912. She died peacefully in her sleep, finally succumbing to something other than a maritime disaster. So what do we make of Violet Jessop? Was she cursed or blessed? The answer? Perhaps is both. She survived the unsurvivable not once but 3 times. The odds of being on even one major shipwreck are tiny. The odds of being on 3, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, all sister ships, are astronomical. It's almost as if fate had marked her, chosen her to witness and survive disasters that killed thousands of others. But survival came with a price. Violet lived with trauma, with nightmares, with the memories of screaming people and sinking ships. She lived with survivor's guilt, wondering why she'd been spared when so many died. She lived with unanswered questions, like the mystery of the baby and the strange phone call decades later. There's something both inspiring and haunting about Violet's story. Inspiring because she refused to give up, refused to let fear win, kept living and working and sailing even after disaster struck again and again. Haunting because we can only imagine the psychological toll of surviving 3 disasters, of being labeled cursed or blessed or jinxed, of carrying those memories for 60 years. The story of the baby adds another layer of mystery. If that phone call was real, if that woman really was the baby Violet, held through the night of April 15, 1912, then why did she hang up? Why didn't she want to talk, to thank Violet, to share her own story? Maybe she didn't want to relive that night either. Maybe she'd spent her whole life trying to forget she'd been on the Titanic, and calling Violet was the only way to confirm her own fragmented memories. Or maybe it wasn't her at all, just someone playing a strange game. We romanticize survivors, but survival isn't always a gift. Violet Jessop lived, yes, but she lived with ghosts. She lived with the question of why. Why her? Why not the 1,500 others? Why did God, if you believe in such things, keep saving her while letting so many others die? And yet, she kept going. That's what strikes me most about Violet. 3 disasters, and she didn't quit. She didn't hide. She didn't let the trauma destroy her. She got back on ships. She kept working. She kept living. That's not just survival. That's courage, Miss Unsinkable, the woman who wouldn't die. The woman who survived the Olympic collision, the Titanic sinking, and the Britannic explosion. The woman who held a mystery baby through the worst night of the 20th century and then got a mysterious phone call 50 years later. The woman who was either the luckiest or unluckiest person who ever lived. Violet Jessop's story reminds us that history isn't just about events, it's about people. Real people who lived through extraordinary circumstances and had to find ways to keep going. Violet could have been just another name on a survivor list. Instead, she became a legend, Miss Unsinkable, the woman who survived it all and lived to tell about it. And somewhere, maybe, an old woman who was once a baby on a lifeboat knows the truth about that night but chose to keep it secret. That's the mystery Violet died without solving. That's the question that will haunt her story forever. 3 disasters. 1 woman. Countless mysteries. That's the extraordinary life of Violet Constance Jessop, the woman who survived the unsurvivable and spent the rest of her life wondering why.